There's a reason witches show up in movies over and over again. Every generation tells witch stories. Sometimes the witch is terrifying, and sometimes she's just misunderstood. Sometimes she's powerful, seductive, mysterious, even glamorous. But what most people don't realize is that the witch in movies isn't just a character, but she's an archetype. And archetypes are powerful because they live inside the collective imagination. They represent deeper truths about power, fear, intuition, and the feminine. So, today we're going to talk about the witch archetype in Hollywood and what it reveals from an occult and spiritual perspective. Because when you start looking closely, you realize Hollywood has been telling the story of the witch in four very specific ways. But before we get into that, if you're somebody who's exploring spirituality beyond traditional religion and want deeper conversations about symbolism, magic, and spiritual development, come join us inside the Modern Day Spiritualist community on the school platform because it's where we explore these ideas in a grounded and thoughtful way. The link is in the description. All right. Now, let's get into these witches and their archetypes in Hollywood. Historically, the word witch has meant many different things. Sometimes it's meant healer, sometimes it's meant herbalist, sometimes it's meant someone who simply refuses to follow the rules of society. And in many cases, women were labeled as witches. Those women were simply women who possessed knowledge, independence, influence, spiritual authority, and those qualities were threatening in certain historical periods, which is why the witch became such a powerful cultural symbol. She represents uncontrolled feminine power, and that power fascinates people, which is why Hollywood keeps revisiting the archetype again and again. So let's get into the first archetype, and this is the Dark Witch. This is the classic villain. You know, the Dark Witch is supposed to represent power without morality. She appears in stories as someone who uses her magic for revenge, domination, manipulation. So, some examples include characters like Maleficent, right? The antagonist in The Witches of Eastwick. From an occult perspective, the Dark Witch represents the shadow side of power. Power itself isn't inherently good or bad, but when someone uses power from a place of bitterness or insecurity, unresolved pain, then it becomes destructive. Hollywood uses this archetype as a warning about what happens when power is disconnected from wisdom. The second one is the initiating witch. Now, this archetype appears in stories where someone is discovering their power. I kind of love these ones. Yeah. The witch isn't fully formed yet, right? But she's learning, she's experimenting, and sometimes she's making mistakes. So, this archetype shows up strongly in The Craft. The characters in that film are essentially going through, I guess, like a magical coming of age story, right? So, from an esoteric perspective, this archetype is going to represent initiation. And in many spiritual traditions, people don't start powerful, right? They begin with curiosity and then gradually develop. Some things they develop are discipline, emotional maturity, or they should be developing, spiritual awareness. The initiating witch represents the beginning of the spiritual path. Now, the third type is the wise witch. The wise witch represents experience. So she's not chaotic, she's not reckless, she understands power and uses it carefully. This archetype appears in characters like the Eldritch in American Horror Story Coven. So the experienced practitioners in practical magic, right? The wise witch symbolizes something important spiritually, and that's that power requires responsibility. So she's learned that magic is not about control, but that it's about alignment, which is why the wise witch archetype is usually calm, grounded, deeply intuitive, right? Now, the fourth one is the enchantress. Enchantress. Anyway, this archetype blends power with magnetism. So the enchantress uses charm and beauty, presence, emotional intelligence. to influence the world around her. So this archetype is often misunderstood because people assume that it's superficial, but esoterically, it represents magnetic energy. Now, the enchantress understands something very important. Power isn't always loud. Sometimes power is subtle. Sometimes it's the ability to captivate a room, to influence without force, to move energy through presence, which is why this archetype has become increasingly popular in modern storytelling. So let's talk about the deeper spiritual meanings, right? If you step back and look at these archetypes together, you'll notice something interesting. They represent different stages of power. You have curiosity and discovery, experimentation and mistakes. Then you have mastery and wisdom, right? And so you also have influence and embodiment. These stages mirror real spiritual development. No one begins as the wise witch. Everyone begins somewhere closer to the initiating witch, learning, experimenting, growing. Hollywood dramatizes the journey, but the underlying pattern reflects something real. Now, from the modern day spiritualist lens, when we think about it from our perspective, the witch archetype represents something that many people are rediscovering today, and I think that's beautiful. Personal spiritual authority. The idea that spirituality isn't only something practiced inside institutions, but that it can also be something cultivated through intuition, personal rituals, energy awareness, self development, even. But the deeper lesson is that power requires grounding. Spiritual development isn't just about aesthetics or symbolism, but it's about maturity and responsibility and learning how to hold energy in a way that benefits both yourself and others. So the next time you watch a movie about witches, pay attention to the archetype being portrayed. Is she reckless? Is she wise? Is she discovering her power? Or is she fully embodying it? Because these archetypes aren't just fictional, they reflect real psychological and spiritual patterns that exist in the world today. And recognizing them can also help you understand both storytelling and spirituality on a deeper level. Now, if you enjoyed this episode of Occult on Screen, let me know in the comments what show or movie should we break down next. Because the occult symbolism hiding in pop culture is deeper than most people even realize. See you in the next episode.